Hey, welcome back. This is the second video from Chapter 8, and we're going to finish talking about labeling theory. The process, we'll start with the process of labeling theory, kind of a review here. Is a primary deviation leads to labeling one as some form of deviant. Deviance is not in the act, but in the definition that the audience puts on the act. So let's take some examples from, let's say, during the 1950s and 60s, children who misbehaved in the classroom were seen as disobedient children that needed to be punished. Today, children who act up or are hyperactive in a classroom are evaluated in terms of perhaps they have ADHD or ADD, or perhaps they're possibly on the autism spectrum. So it is this idea that over time, behaviors we have at once considered deviant or disobedient are now treated as medical conditions. Labeling itself leads to an altered self-image among those who have been labeled. And so what it means is that, what ideas does this assumption make about the self rely on? It makes the idea that our version of ourself, our self-concept, comes from the ways that other people treat us. And if other people treat us and label us as being a bad person, a disobedient student, for example, our self-concept, okay, well, I've been labeled as a disobedient student, so maybe I am a disobedient student, and then therefore the behavior pattern will repeat itself. And this is called the process of internalization, when the person who accepts the deviant label internalizes it and begins to act out that role of the disobedient student. It is throughout this process when we get this idea of a secondary deviant act. And so the secondary deviance occurs when? Well, when the person gets formally involved in the criminal justice system. So essentially what happens is we go from labeling, goes to stereotyping, which goes to separation from the normal group. It goes to status lowering, and then their status loss, and then to actual outright discrimination against the person who was labeled. So I mentioned earlier about some behavior patterns that were at one time. So when I say deviance is, what is a deviant act? Is the people who are in power get to make define what acts are deviance. And so I mentioned it earlier that throughout times, forms of behavior that were once considered socially acceptable are now considered deviant, and vice versa. So let's take the first case here. This is the smoking on the plane example I mentioned in video 1. Here's a picture from the 1970s of people smoking on a flight. Okay? And today, this is what you see on every plane, no smoking. There's never any smoking allowed on planes anymore. Here's a map of the United States. Essentially, half of the population, I think it's actually more than half now, live in the United States, live in a state which has some form of legalized marijuana, whether it's either openly recreational use like the green states here, or at least legalized marijuana, which is in the blue states. These are, so at least half the population. Of course, 20 years ago, this would all have been gray. When I was, in the year 2000, just to go back to the turn of the 21st century, there were no states that were legalizing this. Here's a favorite. This is, I showed you this earlier. This is a picture of a cough syrup that was given to children. It's expensive. Look at it, $4.85 an ounce in the year 1901. So I don't know what that would equal today, but that'd be a ton of money. But it's heroin. It's liquid heroin. And it was given to babies to essentially help them sleep. Cough syrup. Okay, you got a cough? Take some heroin. Made by the Bear Aspirin Company. And here's a picture of an old hypodermic kit. They used to sell these in the Sears and Roebuck catalog. You could buy your hypodermics to shoot up heroin and also opium of some forms. So, yeah, these things are not legal today. We don't prescribe heroin for coughs anymore. You can get still cocaine is still was a legal drug for a very long time, and it's still around in some derivative forms legally. Novocaine, you have a toothache, you go in, they shoot you up with Novocaine. That's just a form of cocaine. But it used to be in Coca-Cola as well. I guess you've heard that rumor. Yeah, so the acts of deviance have changed over time. Okay, sorry. Shaming. It's an important part of the labeling process. What is shaming? Deviants are shamed. We put labels on them and we make them go through what we call a shaming ritual. I'll give you a couple examples here in just a minute. It's stigmatizing as someone as an outsider and a troublemaker, etc. Master status, we've already talked about. It's one that people evaluate most than most others. Being a criminal is a master status. Okay, 47% of employment regulations prohibit people with any felony conviction from being hired, even if the is not even a non-violent felon. Okay, so it will affect your life significantly. Um, Labeling theorists talk about two types of people. They talk about social junk and social dynamite, and the argument is that the entire criminal justice system is there to control social junk and social dynamite. And the social junk are those with dependency issues and chronic unemployment. The social dynamite are those who are seen as violent and potentially dangerous. Um, it, Social junk and social dynamite typically refer to people of color and poor whites. And the criminal justice system is one of the mechanisms through which social junk and social dynamite are controlled by those who don't want to have to deal with these situations. The criminal justice system mets out much tougher penalties for, frankly, very low impact crimes compared to white collar crime. All right, so when it comes to labeling, we have to know several types of people. One are rule creators, and these are the people who make the rules that define deviance. Um, and one of the most important subgroups is what we call moral entrepreneurs. So moral entrepreneurs are people who look for opportunities to define deviance, and they get to define who the outsiders are. And they have the ability to impose right and wrong definitions on other people. And in order to do that, you have to have a lot of power. Where does the power come from? Well, it's economic, it's political, and it's social. And it's crucial. You need to understand this. Labeling is a moral exercise or a moral enterprise. It requires the support of powerful institutions or organizations. It's an interactive process. Who has the power between the labeler and the labeled? Well, the labeler has the power. So one of the ways in which rule creators exercise their power is through appealing to experts. Okay? These experts typically are those who have recognition as being experts. They have professional backing, they have education, they have licenses to practice their craft. They have institutionalized power. What I mean by that is that they basically have the support of government and other institutions to make these kinds of decisions. So who are some labelers when it comes to criminal justice? Parents, teachers are labelers, the police, psychiatrists, doctors, and in some cases your peers. These folks get to determine what is normal. So, I'll give you an example. For the longest time, women could be institutionalized for being hysterics, in other words, or for suffering from hysteria. And doctors, male, at the time only men could be doctors, labeled women as hysteric for things like postpartum depression, PMS, my favorite being disobedient to your husband. Remember the common scold comment from the New Jersey court case? Epilepsy was considered institutionalized offense. You've been labeled a hysteric by the medical community, and that's a label you can't shake. Moral entrepreneurs are those who crusade and get attempt to extend deviant definitions. So one of the biggest moral crusades in the United States ever launched successfully was the Women Christian Temperance Union, who were able to get prohibition signed into law in 1920, excuse me, and outlawed alcohol for 12 years until 1932, and President Roosevelt, upon his election, decided, I really need to tax the bottles that alcohol are in, so we're going to repeal prohibition, and he did. Some other examples of moral crusaders today: MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. This is not a comment about whether or not their cause is right, but I'm just telling you this is who they are. And so what did MAD do? Well, in the 1980s, MAD was able to get drinking ages raised from 18 to 21. When I was in college, drinking age was 21. By the time I graduated from college, drinking age was, it was 18. By the time I graduated from college, it was 21. And there was no grandfather clause. If you were 19 when the drinking age was raised, you were not allowed to drink. Gun control is a moral crusade. Those people who are trying to extend the act of deviance to people who own guns. There's moral crusades in terms of stem cell research, anti-abortion movement, environmentalist movement. These are all examples on the left and the right of moral crusades. Pro-vax groups. Are they moral entrepreneurs? Are the people who are for vaccination trying to get those who refuse to take vaccination labeled as deviants or kooks, not crooks, kooks, deviants or kooks, or in some way. Now, I'm pro-vax. Please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying don't take your vaccines. I think it's important. But I understand this objectively looking at the movement, the pro-vax movement. It is a form of moral entrepreneurship because they are trying to get people who don't want to get vaccines labeled as deviants, troublemakers. On the other side of this, there have been attempts and successful attempts to retract definitions, remove the labels. Okay, so like I said earlier, we've gone from behavior that was okay to being labeled as deviant, like smoking on planes, or really smoking anywhere. Well, let's go the other way. Behavior that was once considered deviant behavior now is considered normal or okay. So probably the biggest in my lifetime has been the gay rights movement. When I was in college in the 1980s, homosexuality was still considered a psychological disorder, and it was in the whatever MS or whatever book that psychological book of disorders was in. Gay marriage was illegal, and but now gay marriage is the law of the land, and the gay rights movement is clearly seen as a modern force in our society. And homosexuality is no longer considered a psychological disorder by the American Psychological Association. Pot legalization. So, pot was illegal when I was a kid. It's illegal everywhere. Today, it is about half the population lives in a state where it's legal in some form. DAM stands for Drunks Against Mad Mothers, and that's just a joke I put in there. I stole that from a National Lampoon magazine I had years ago. It's not really a thing. But anti-vaxxers. And so are the anti-vaxxers trying to get the deviant label removed? Okay, so who are the anti-vaxxers and the resistors in this movement? Are they trying to get that become more mainstream? Like, oh, it's fine to not take your vaccines. We don't really need them. It's all about nature and you'll be fine anyhow. I don't believe that. Again, repeating, I think you should take vaccines. But objectively looking at the movement, that's clearly one of the things that's going on. And then lastly, there's a movement in age of consent laws, which can be disturbing. So what is the age of consent of marriage? Does it need to be lowered, or does it need to be raised? Or right now it depends on the state, but um, you know, people under 18 have to have special permission to get married. Some people would like to do away with that. I do not support that. I certainly don't support changing the age of consent laws when it comes to sexual intercourse. And I don't have an opinion on tattoos. If your parents say it's okay, right now you have to have permission from your parent to get a tattoo in most states. If you're under 18, I don't have any tattoos. If your parents say it's fine to get one, fine. Should a 14-year-old be allowed to walk into a tattoo parlor and ink themselves for life? Probably not. I would think the parent would have some say in that. I would like to know if my son was doing that. But that's just one of the current movements that are out there. All right, rule enforcers. So the rule enforcers are government mainly. They are responsible for order in a community, and it's the police and the court systems that enforce the rules. The state is the only sanctioned use of violence in our society. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about shaming rituals. When you go in, once you're labeled as a deviant, once you are hit that secondary deviance, and you have to go into some form of punishment, whether it be the prison or what have you, there's always a shaming ritual. So the shaming ritual is really important. It's where all of society essentially agrees that, yeah, you deserve this master status label as a deviant, whether it's a criminal or an excommunicated member of a church or what have you. The shaming ritual is important because it allows society to feel like, yes, you have been treated fairly, and we've decided your behavior is so egregious you need to be shamed and punished in this way. So how do we do this in our society today? So court-martial, military court-martial is a form of shaming ritual. Conviction in a court. Think about what conviction in court is. You've got the whole ritual. The judge comes in, right? Everybody stands up, and then everybody sits down, and the judge asks the jury, "Have you reached a decision?" "Yes, we have, Your Honor." "May I see it?" It's all a ritual. They grab the paper, they take it to the judge. The judge reads it and just has a stone faced, right? And then hands the paper back to the bailiff, who takes it back to the um, jury foreperson, and that foreperson is then asked to read the verdict. And while this is happening, the convicted is required to stand, right? "You, sir, stand and listen to the verdict being read." And then the person will read the verdict. "We find the defendant guilty of being a common skull," or whatever. And then, the judge thanks the jury and dismisses them. And then the judge says, typically a sentence is not handed out at that time. They will reset sentencing for a later time. And then at the sentencing, what happens? There's more shaming ritual. The victims of the crime get to come in and say their piece. And they get to come up in front of the whole audience and tell you what a terrible thing you've done and how you've hurt them in all of these ways. And then the judge passes sentence. And then you are escorted out. Typically, you're put in handcuffs and taken back to your holding cell. Or you might be released and then asked to report to prison at a certain time, particularly if you are a white-collar criminal. You tend to get a little bit more grace there. So that's a ritual we've seen in court, but there's an excommunication ritual from the church. There's a shaming ritual when it comes to psychiatric commitment. So there are lots of different, when people are shamed, there are lots of different rituals which they go through. So why are these important? Because they help separate deviance from the group. The shaming ritual is important because it's the official labeling process. You have now been labeled as a convicted felon, and you have faced your day in court. You've been judged by your peers and found guilty, and you are going to be punished in some way, maybe probation, probably prison. So what happens when you get back out? Can you get back into society? Yes and no. You can never get fully back in because you're always going to carry that label. But you can come back into society if you're willing to go through a reintegration shaming ritual. So let's say you're up for parole. What do you have to do with parole? In order to get parole, you basically have to reconfess your crimes. Even if you maintain your innocence all throughout the trial and all throughout everything else, if you want to get out on parole, you better be willing to stipulate that you were, yes, I did what I thought, what I was convicted of doing. Otherwise, they're going to let you sit in prison until your sentence runs out. And I always like to talk about Alcoholic Anonymous. Okay, so AA is a good group. I think it has a lot of benefit to. It has a proven track record of getting people off of alcohol addiction and back into society. But there are shaming rituals, right? Every time you get up in front of that group, what do you have to do? You have to confess that you are a practicing alcoholic, that you will always be a practicing alcoholic, and that it's not a status you can ever shake. But you've been sober for X number of days or years or whatever it might be. But that is a reintegration shaming ritual. And I would like to be admitted back into society with the label that I am an alcoholic, although I've been sober for 15 years. That is a reintegration shaming ritual. Let's stop.